Hey there. Tonight we're exploring the history of the White House furniture, from Adams-era bare rooms to the quiet glow of the resolute desk. The truth is, most of what looks original is a careful blend of survivors, restorations, and thoughtful replacements. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise, or grab your favorite blanket and let's drift into tonight's story together. The most famous desk in America started life as the planking of a British Arctic rescue ship. The most iconic White House bed never hosted the president whose name it carries. And a 19th century First Lady once turned the executive mansion into a showroom, so elaborate that Congress opened an investigation. White House furniture has been torched in war, auctioned off by wagon load, rebuilt from steel-framed rubble, lacquered in Gilded Age glamour, sanded back to founding-era austerity, and then curated like a world-class museum. Chairs in this building have supported everything from parlor, diplomacy, to generational drama, and they have the scratches to prove it. The story starts in November 1800. John Adams moved into what the Masons still called the President's house. The plaster was wet, the walls were raw, and the place smelled like a construction site after a thunderstorm. With Congress finally meeting in Washington, D.C., the Adamses began ordering basic furnishings for rooms that echoed like empty caves. City commissioners scrambled to outfit the place with the fundamentals: beds, tables, chairs, carpets, and enough drapery to make the drafts tolerable. A handful of pieces migrated from Philadelphia's presidential lodgings. But this was not Versailles, rolling south on wagons. Early White House interiors were a mashup of rented, borrowed, and quickly purchased federal-style furniture, with a few elegant imports tucked in like exclamation points. Thomas Jefferson took over in 1801 and treated the house like an Enlightenment lab. He had taste, a long memory for French craftsmanship, and a suspicion of anything too showy for Republican dignity. He acquired refined Parisian pieces that fit the neoclassical mood: sleek mahogany, brass mounts, restrained ornament, transported a taste level learned as minister to France, and mixed in American work by New York and Philadelphia cabinet makers. He brought order to the dining rooms, sophistication to reception spaces, and a touch of curiosity cabinet to the entrance hall, where Native American artifacts from Western expeditions shared space with classical busts. It was stylish and cerebral, the interior equivalent of a Latin aside in a letter to a friend. Then history brought fire. In August 1814, during the War of 1812, British troops marched into Washington and torched the White House. The heat blew out windows and blistered paint. Furniture went up like tinder. Dolly Madison famously directed the rescue of Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington. The rescue happened, but not with Dolly slashing canvases, with a dinner knife while smoke billowed dramatically around her. The steward, the doorman, and several others took the frame apart and hustled the canvas out before the redcoats arrived, as Dolly wrote from a safe distance. The furniture, meanwhile, was largely lost. When the smoke cleared, the executive mansion stood a hollowed-out sandstone shell with a charred interior. Congress appropriated funds to rebuild and refurnish. When James Monroe took office in 1817, He walked into a blank slate with a $20,000 furniture, appropriation, and the sense that the United States needed to look like it belonged on the world stage. He chose Paris. In 1818, he ordered a glittering suite from the atelier of Pierre-Antoine Bélanger, gilded beechwood, severe classical lines, anthemia, and delicate sphinxes perched like footnotes from a Roman antiquities manual. The Bélanger order comprised 53 pieces, delivered to fit the elliptical blue room, a space that still feels like a cameo brooch. It cost thousands out of the $20,000 pot and screamed post-Napoleonic grandeur with a Republican accent. More than 2 centuries later, at least 9 original Bélanger pieces have been tracked down and returned to the White House collection, with reproductions filling in gaps, so the Blue Room reads as Monroe intended. The White House Historical Association loves this suite, like a long-lost band back together for a reunion tour. Monroe did not stop with Bélanger. American craftsmen like Duncan Phyfe in New York and Charles-Honoré Lannoy, a French émigré in New York, were also part of the White House story by the 1810s and 1820s. Their work, sleek saber-legged chairs, lyre-based tables, glowing mahogany anchored rooms with domestic skill matching European pedigree. The symbol of choice became the American eagle, spreading wings across console tables and chair crests. Eagle-supported pier tables turned up in staterooms like patriotic mic drops. Greek key trim marched across sofas. The house evolved into a catalogue of early 19th century neoclassicism, punctuated by occasional panic over budgets and the wear and tear of constant entertaining. Andrew Jackson arrived in 1829, determined to make the place open to the people and tough enough for the traffic. His administration leaned into durable American empire forms, solid, sculptural, a little martial. Philadelphia cabinet maker Anthony Quavell supplied pieces of brawny elegance for staterooms. Heavy sofas and chairs, with scroll arms and lion paw feet, could survive boots, spurs, and the occasional toasting gone exuberant. These rooms were not private salons. They were stages for diplomacy, receptions, and arguments that could rearrange the nation's future before dessert. And then Victorian exuberance landed with both feet. By the 1840s and 1850s, Rococo revival curves joined the party. Upholstery bloomed. Carvings of fruit, flowers, and seashells migrated onto crest rails and table aprons. During Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan's terms, fashionable mahogany and rosewood pieces in the style of John Henry Belter made rooms look like botanical gardens carved by a cabinet maker who loved drama as much as dowels. Harriet Lane, Buchanan's influential niece and White House hostess, ushered in taste with European savvy. Draperies multiplied. Parlor sets expanded. Surfaces reflected gaslight in shiny waves. Mary Lincoln arrived in 1861 with wartime reality bearing down and a firmly Victorian eye. Congress gave a $20,000 redirection fund. She outran it by $6,858, triggering a quiet scandal that later required creative accounting. She ordered an ornate rosewood bed for what was then known as the Prince of Wales Room, from William Carriel and Sons of Philadelphia, along with wardrobes, parlor, sets, and enough gilded wallpaper to make a Dowager Duchess blush. The bed remains famous as the Lincoln bed, and here comes another irresistible myth to sort out. Abraham Lincoln did not sleep in that bed. He worked late into the night in his upstairs office, and his actual sleeping room was different. The bed Mary bought gained its Lincoln aura later. after the room morphs and renamings of the 20th century. The storytelling appeal is undeniable. The facts are stubborn. By the 1870s, American taste pivoted again, this time toward the aesthetic movement. Surfaces traded, clustered fruits for Japanese-inspired lines, peacock feathers, and ebonized finishes. And then Chester A. Arthur detonated precedent. In 1881, he called in Louis Comfort Tiffany and his firm to reinvent the staterooms. Tiffany responded with stained glass, patterned floors, and a colossal glass-walled screen in the entrance hall that looked like a jewel box collided with a Moorish arcade. Rich color poured through gasoliers. Design magazines swooned. Many Washington traditionalists did not. To make room, the Arthur administration held an 1882 public auction that sent 24 wagon loads of earlier furniture, draperies, and carpets clattering out the gates. That clearance included precious early pieces, some dating back to Monroe. A portion of those wagons hauled off Belanger chairs that would take the White House decades and donor diplomacy to reacquire. If an American version of the British Antiques Roadshow ever gets filmed inside a DC attic, a Belanger armchair, misidentified as Grandma's gold chair, would be the plot twist producers beg for. The Tiffany look dominated the 1880s. Then 1902 arrived with Theodore Roosevelt and a mandate to modernize. Roosevelt hired McKim, Mead and White, a firm with a genius for classical order. They kicked the Victorian out with gusto. The West Wing was created to move the president's daily business out of the family floors. The staterooms were rebuilt as dignified neoclassical showpieces, inspired by the house's federal origins. Out went the Tiffany screens and patterned excess. In came restrained paneling, mirrored symmetry, and rooms arranged around period themes that still rule the state floor. The green room became a federal-style parlor. The red room took on American Empire gravitas. The blue room restored its French neoclassical dewliness, with Monroe's suite, in part original, in part meticulously recreated. This 1902 overhaul also produced heavyweight furniture classics. The state dining room, panelled in oak with Beaux-Arts, swagger, received a matching suite of dining furniture from A. Davenport and Company of Boston. The chairs, hefty, Jacobean-style beasts with carved eagles crowning the crest rails, still show up in official dinners. They advertise Theodore Roosevelt's personality in walnut and upholstery, a reminder that food tastes better when the chairs look like they can command a cavalry charge. Another major player rolled in on casters a year later. In 1903, Steinway & Sons delivered its 100,000th piano to the White House, a gilded art case grand with an intricately painted lid by Thomas Wilmer Dewing. The thing was a conversation piece with 13 dancing figures representing the arts, shimmering under gaslight in the East Room. By 1938, it was replaced by a more restrained Steinway Model D, case number 300,000, designed with sculptor Paulmanship and architect Eric Guler, perched on satinwood legs carved as gold eagles. That 1938 Steinway remains in the East Room today, a working monument to American craftsmanship and presidential sing-alongs. Harry Truman, an accomplished amateur pianist, played it with the pride of a Missourian who knew a good chord progression. The desk drama, meanwhile, had already acquired Arctic backstory. In 1855, the British Royal Navy rescued Ames, Resolute, an expedition ship abandoned in Arctic ice while searching for Sir John Franklin. The Americans salvaged and returned the ship to Britain, as a goodwill gesture. When Resolute was retired and broken up in 1879, Queen Victoria ordered desks made from its timbers. The largest, a partner's desk rimmed with rope-carved moulding and pilastered corners, was presented to Rutherford B. Hayes in 1880 for the White House. The plaque inside reads with the formality of a Victorian calling card. Over time, the Resolute desk drifted through different locations, various offices and exhibition spaces, and absorbed myths the way pine absorbs polish. Franklin Roosevelt asked for a privacy panel to fill the knee hole, and in 1945 a carved front was installed, featuring the presidential seal. The Great Seal on that panel faced left toward the arrows of war, because that was the standard orientation at the time. In 1945, Harry Truman directed that the seal face right toward the olive branch of peace, a heraldic tweak, now standard. The result is a desk whose front panel politely contradicts the carpet. Another irresistible myth circles the Resolute like a viral TikTok. There are no secret compartments. There are drawers and a historic lock mechanism. Nicolas Cage did not hide a ciphered map in the baseboard. The desk does harbor a relay of stories, including photos of John F. Kennedy's children playing underneath while their father worked, but its mystery ends with excellent joinery and a solid naval backstory. Presidential desks actually form a small of American furniture, celebrities. The Theodore Roosevelt desk of 1903, a dignified mahogany piece by A. Davenport, answered the president's workspace after the West Wing came into being. The Hoover desk was introduced after a 1929 West Wing fire destroyed much of the working suite. It embodied late 1920s style, with clean lines and the sturdy gravitas expected of furniture that supports statecraft. The Wilson desk, used by Richard Nixon, under the belief that it had belonged to Woodrow Wilson, carried a label that turned out to trace to Vice President Henry Wilson of the Grant era. Nixon still used it in the Oval Office. It later moved to the Vice President's ceremonial office across West Executive Avenue in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. Oval Office furnishings came to symbolize presidential identity as much as policy. Desks, rugs and lamps turned into visual shorthand for leadership style in every administration's official photos. Back inside the main house, the first half of the 20th century was a tug-of-war between modernization and heritage. Electricity arrived in the 1890s. Radiators sprouted, telephones hid in cabinets. A formal family dining room evolved upstairs, and then the floor literally started to give way. Inspectors declared the building structurally unsound in 1948. Floors sagged. Chandeliers swayed. The East Room could host receptions, but not safely. The solution was surgical reconstruction. Between 1948 and 1952, the White House was gutted to its sandstone shell and rebuilt with a modern steel frame. Harry Truman commissioned the famous Truman balcony on the South Portico in 1947, fighting off purist critics who called it an architectural sin until it visually settled into one of the house's best design calls. The Truman reconstruction produced a paradox. The exterior looked the same. The interior was new from joist to doorknob. That meant furniture too. Period-style reproductions proliferated, anchored by a few surviving originals, and a lot of mid-century craftsmanship built to echo Federal and Empire forms. In the East Room, Truman installed the 1938 Steinway, and staged state events more safely than ever. Yet the White House still behaved like a home where each incoming family made deep personal marks, and each outgoing family packed up more than suitcases. Presidents arriving before 1961 often treated furniture like semi-private property. Items could be moved out, swapped, auctioned, or simply worn out in the line of duty. The executive mansion had history, but it did not yet have a curator with veto power. That changed dramatically with Jacqueline Kennedy. In 1961, the Kennedys created the office of the White House curator and formed a fine arts committee chaired by Henry Francis DuPont of Winterthur Museum. They announced a new rule that finally made emotional sense. White House furnishings would be considered a permanent collection held in trust for the American people, not the incoming family's redecorating stash. The White House Historical Association was founded the same year to publish a guidebook and use the proceeds to acquire historic furnishings. The first curator, Lorraine Waxman Pierce, began cataloging with scholarly relish. The Kennedy Project triggered a rescue mission for lost masterpieces. Original Monroe Belanger chairs previously sold off resurfaced in private hands. Dons stepped forward. Auction catalogues suddenly mattered. Philadelphia and New York cabinet makers reclaimed their rightful chapters in the story. The Blue Room regained authentic Belanger sparkle. The Green Room gained federal elegance. The Red Room took on robust empire pieces, connected to American makers like Duncan Phyfe and Joseph Meeks. Stephan Boudin of Maison Janssen provided an eye for arrangement and textiles, sometimes controversially French, always precise. The White House became, in historian William Seal's words, a house with a memory. The Nixon years extended the collecting push. First Lady Pat Nixon, working with curator Clement Conger, aggressively sought early American furnishings and decorative arts to fill out the period room scheme. Hundreds of antiques entered the collection between 1969 and 1970, often by gift. The cabinet room furniture took on a unique ceremonial quirk in 1970 when the Kittinger Company of Buffalo crafted a new cabinet room table and matching chairs, each with a brass plate engraved with the name of its occupant. Later, departing cabinet secretaries signed the underside and took home their chair as a personal memento, a perk that turned official seating into a rite of passage. The Kittinger suite balanced historic style with modern function, a subtle reminder that not all valuable White House furniture needs to be 2 centuries old to matter. The Oval Office played its own game of musical chairs, with symbolism. John F. Kennedy brought the resolute desk into the Oval Office in 1961, Lyndon Johnson preferring a different work surface and a layout that suited his style, changed up the furniture, and later relocated the Resolute. Richard Nixon installed the Wilson desk, thinking Woodrow Wilson had once used it, then learned it had belonged to a different Wilson entirely. In 1977, Jimmy Carter returned the Resolute desk to the Oval Office and elevated it from a connoisseur's favorite to a pop culture icon. Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden have all used it in the Oval. It appears in photographs beside legislation, world leaders, and the occasional trick-or-treat bin. It has seen children crawl through the knee-hole, pens scratch out treaties, and cameras immortalize the shine on its Victorian varnish. The smaller dramas of furniture show the shifting identity of the house. The state dining room chairs evolved across the 20th century, with upholstery oscillating between bold stripes, damasks, and sober solids, depending on the First Lady's eye and the decade's aesthetic metabolism. The Lincoln bedroom's bed, Mary Lincoln's 1861 purchase, became the stage for everything from sleeping heads of state to late-night gossip about who slept in it, in which. Administration. The China Room received custom vitrines to display the growing presidential China collection, a project started by Caroline Harrison in 1889 and brought into elegant focus by First Ladies in the 20th century. The Diplomatic Reception Room, once a ground-floor storage space, turned into a gracious elliptical chamber warmed by a fireplace and ringed in Zuba wallpaper showing early American scenes. Its furniture now mixes American federal chairs with occasional English pieces and a few diplomatic gifts, an intentional nod to the room's international handshake function. Restorations and acquisitions continue to feed the collection. A Belanger sofa reappeared in the 1970s. A set of original Monroe armchairs came home in the 1960s and 1970s, filling the Blue Room like the return of crown jewels. Console tables bearing American eagles were linked to specific early administrations through invoices and memoirs. Rare American card tables by Charles Honoré Lenouet with gilt mounts and extraordinary veneers were tracked, authenticated, and placed where their period logic read clearly. A Philadelphia sideboard, once dismissed as an old buffet, was recognized as a significant federal piece and restored to dignity in a stateroom arrangement. These wins often arrived thanks to donors and meticulous research shared by the White House Historical Association, the National Park Service, and scholars who could read an 1818 invoice the way cryptanalysts read ciphers. Myths cling to the furniture as fiercely as varnish. Dolly Madison saved the Washington portrait, but she did not hack it out with a house knife while flames licked the wainscoting. The Lincoln bed did not host Abraham Lincoln between cabinet meetings. The resolute desk holds no secret compartments beyond the minds of screenwriters. One more myth deserves a gentle poke. The phrase "Washington slept here" has been stapled onto more American furniture than probably any other three words in antiques dealing. The first president never lived in the White House. By the time John Adams moved in, George Washington had been retired to Mount Vernon for a year. Any chair in the White House labeled Washington's is either a commemorative placement, an import, or a conflation of presidents and places. The truth is more interesting. The house itself became Washington's monument by design, and the furniture inside it evolved as the country did. Style tells its own political story. Early federal and French Empire choices telegraphed a young nation craving legitimacy through neoclassical dignity. Gothic and Rococo flourishes of mid-century salted the rooms with sentiment and Victorian exuberance. The Tiffany era shouted cosmopolitan Gilded Age ambition. The 1902 Roosevelt refit deliberately re-entered the house in a narrative of austere Republican classicism. The Truman rebuild quietly admitted the progress requires steel beneath tradition. The Kennedy reinvention declared that national heritage is not nostalgia, it is curated identity. Each chair leg, finial, and drawer-pull participates in that dialogue. Functional innovations leave traces as well. Gaslighting arrived in the 1840s and 1850s, replacing candle stands with gasoliers that cast a more consistent glow over textiles and wood surfaces. Electricity transformed that equation in the 1890s, complicating the placement of tables and desks with the new tyranny of outlets and cords. Telephones migrated into cabinets and then became desk fixtures. Radio microphones demanded stable supports and unobtrusive stands. Television cameras changed seating scales and sight lines, turning the East Room into a stage that furniture needed to frame elegantly on screen. Even climate control affected choices, since dry, forced air heating and air conditioning changed how fragile veneers and gilding aged. The curator's office quietly orchestrates these battles, balancing conservation data with diplomatic theater. Material culture has quietly political edges. American eagles sprout on everything from console tables to fireplace andirons, asserting iconography of state. Olive branches and arrows appear not just on seals, but carved into chair rails and table aprons, soft-spoken messages to foreign delegations seated beneath them. Woods tell stories too. Mahogany, once imported from the Caribbean, carries histories of global trade. Rosewood in Rococo Revival sets came from tropical forests that furniture historians now view with uncomfortable awareness of colonial resource extraction. Gilding and textiles represent labor systems often erased by glossy surfaces. Gilders, upholsterers, seamstresses, and finishers whose hands made the objects that first ladies selected and heads of state admired. There is also the matter of wear. State dinners are not friendly to chair stretchers. Receptions and tours mean thousands of feet passing through weekly. Pets carve their memoirs in table legs. Franklin Roosevelt's Scottish Terrier, Fala, had opinions about rugs. Later first pets contributed casual patina. Moving crews learned to protect delicate veneers with felt and strategy. Paint crews mastered the art of working around heavy mirrors and pier tables without letting gravity win. The executive residence trade staff, under the chief usher and the curator, choreograph more furniture ballet in a dawn than most museums handle in a week. Auctions and reacquisitions punctuate the timeline like unlikely reunion episodes. The 1882 Arthur Clear Out sent priceless Monroe pieces to the wind. The 20th century brought them home. A 1903 Steinway retired to a museum life. Its 1938 successor took over the soundtrack. The West Wing's 1929 fire forced Herbert Hoover into temporary quarters and a new desk. Subsequent administrations layered their own preferences over the workspace. The Eisenhower Executive Office building became the repository of older desks, like the Wilson, tucked into ceremonial rooms, with ceilings so high the furniture looks like intricate dollhouse pieces on a chessboard the size of a ballroom. The White House furniture has always played double duty as both objects of use and instruments of statecraft. The state dining room table enforces hierarchy with its placement cards as effectively as any throne room. The cabinet room table funnels argument into rectangular order. The diplomatic reception room sofas create intimate angles that reduce first meeting awkwardness. The treaty room upstairs has hosted the signing of documents that bent history's arc. Its 1869 cabinet table bears drawers labeled with 19th century department names, a tactile reminder that modern governance grows from older roots. Those labels, State, Treasury, War, Navy, Post Office, Interior, are typography with meaning, set into wood that trembled when major decisions landed on it. The visual record helps anchor all of this. Matthew Brady's Civil War photographs catch early rooms with their layered textiles and curving sofas. Black and white images of the Tiffany makeover glow with gaslight reflections. 1902 renovation photos show paneled dignity descending like a classical curtain. Color film captures mid-century upholstery that could double as Mad Men wardrobe inspiration. Television, amplified choices. When Nancy Reagan selected a formal French-inflected look for staterooms in the 1980s, the frames loved it. Hillary Clinton's embrace of American arts and crafts patterns for private spaces read as a modernized nod to tradition. Michelle Obama's contemporary art placement against period furniture turned heads and created a fresh dialogue between objects and ideas. Jill Biden's selections of art and objects place empathy beside endurance, one carefully chosen bust or painting at a time. The furniture persists, holding the stage while art and policy rotate around it. Provenance has become a contact sport with manners. The curator's office traces pieces with forensic interest. Maker's marks beneath the seat chalk, inscriptions, and undocumented repairs that hint at a long life of rearrangement. The White House Historical Association publishes research that clarifies who made what, when, and for whom. Major sources include William Seal's multi-volume The President's House, the National Park Service's Historic Furnishings, reports for each room, Smithsonian catalogs that identify related pieces in national collections, and period account books that survived more administrations than certain policies. Auction houses learn to bring their A-teams when something with White House whispers appears in a consignment. Behind the theatricality, pragmatic details tick along. JSA tags discreetly, identify federal property. Inventory lists update after every move. Climate logs read like medical charts. Conservators with microscopes decide whether a Belanger gilded arm should receive isinglass glue or a micro-injection of consolidant to arrest flaking. Upholstery fabrics, often custom woven to replicate period designs, require lead times measured in seasons. A single curtain panel can take a small team weeks to cut. Line, interline, and handsew, all for an effect that reads to the public as simply beautiful. That combination of invisible labor and visible splendor has defined White House furniture from the moment the first footman slid a mahogany chair into place for a state guest in 1800. Even the jokes carry history. Visitors see the cabinet room, chairs with brass nameplates, and assume the chairs are trophies. They are, but with rules. The chairs travel across administrations, gaining engraved nameplates like a very serious varsity jacket. Departing cabinet secretaries sometimes buy their chair as a sanctioned souvenir, a practice formalized with invoices and sanctioners that make for surprisingly popular mementos. In this house, everything meaningful is documented twice and photographed thrice. Furniture has also served as diplomacy without words. The resolute desk's British origin makes it a permanent reminder that former adversaries can become allies. The Belanger suite telegraphs a long friendship with France, a reminder that Republican taste and imperial Paris share a complicated aesthetic DNA. American Eagle tables by Lanouet prove that immigrant craftsmen built symbols for a new nation with European training and American confidence. Each piece becomes a thesis on cultural exchange, delivered in wood and gilt. The White House collection is not a static stash. Gifts from foreign dignitaries sometimes include furniture, which may join the collection or move to the National Archives as governed by law. The office of the curator constantly weighs historical accuracy against current function. Modern chairs occasionally enter rooms for accessibility or comfort during long meetings, then vanish for tours that require period continuity. Private family spaces upstairs flex much more with each administration, blending personal sofas and lamps with institutional pieces on loan from the collection, all carefully inventoried so nothing wanders off into memory. The glamour is never the whole story. Ware tells truths that landscaping cannot hide. That state dining room table has felt the heat from centerpieces and the drag of plates late into the night. Chair rails bear faint nicks from swords, once worn at a diplomatic reception, marks kept quiet by polish and tradition. Carpets absorb the tempo of events. After a state dinner, the legs of chairs show a pattern of tiny glides in the nap that maps conversation patterns better than any seating chart. Those traces wash out in vacuum lines by morning. Preservation sometimes requires disciplined restraint. Original finishes that turned orange under century-old varnish can be coaxed back toward mellow with careful solvent gels. Gilding retouches aim for invisibility. Overzealous restoration can erase the very age that gives an object meaning. The curator's office favors reversal, documentation, and minimal intervention. Standards borrowed from museum conservation, but adapted to a building that still hosts live events at state scale. The balance is delicate, especially in crisis. Water leaks from historic plumbing, beverage spills from 300 dinner guests, and the occasional wayward heel find wood and silk like heat-seeking missiles. The house survives and so do the objects, because professionals treat every chair like a primary source. A quick tour of greatest hits lands some specifics in the ledger. Bélanger's 1818 Blue Room Suite. 53 pieces ordered, at least 9 originals now back on site, supplemented with accurate reproductions. The style, French Empire filtered through Monroe's eye, became the Blue Room's permanent DNA. Source references include the White House Historical Association's catalog entries and period invoices. The Tiffany Makeover under Chester A. Arthur, commissioned 1881, executed 1881, executed 1881, 1882 by Louis Comfort Tiffany and Associated Artists, dismantled in 1902. That 1882 auction moved 24 wagon loads of furniture and decor out the gate, including earlier Monroe pieces. As chronicled by newspaper ads, and later research by William Seal. The 1902 Roosevelt renovation by McKim, Mead and White created the West Wing, reorganized the state floor, and introduced the A. Davenport dining suite, with eagle-crested chairs still used. Photographers and architectural drawings document the shift from Victorian bric-a-brac to Beaux-Arts order. The 1903 Steinway No. 100,000. A gilded art case, grand with lid painting by Thomas Wilmer Dewing, replaced by the 1938 Steinway No. 300,000 designed, with Eric Gugler and sculpted eagles by Paul Manship. Steinway archives confirm both piano specifics. The 1938 instrument remains an East Room workhorse. The Resolute desk, presented 1880 to Rutherford B. Hayes by Queen Victoria. Privacy panel, added in 1945 at Franklin Roosevelt's request. Desk, placed in the Oval Office by John F. Kennedy in 1961. Returned by Jimmy Carter in 1977. Used by subsequent presidents, including Reagan, Clinton, Obama, Trump, and Biden. The myth busts hold. No secret compartments. The seal orientation mismatch dates to Harry Truman's 1945 change. The Wilson desk, misattributed to Woodrow Wilson, actually linked to Vice President Henry Wilson. Used in the Oval Office by Richard Nixon, later moved to the Vice President's Ceremonial Office in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. National Archives documentation, and the White House documentation, and the White House Historical Association detail the provenance correction. The Truman reconstruction, 1948, 1952, comprehensive rebuild with a new steel frame, original exterior retained. Period-style furnishings installed with an eye toward federal and empire coherence, while the 1938 Steinway and other 20th century elements anchored modern function. The National Park Service maintains exhaustive records of this project. The Kennedy Curation Revolution, 1961 creation of the Curator's Office and the Fine Arts Committee, recovery of original Monroe pieces. Establishment of the White House Historical Association to fund acquisitions via the official guidebook. Henry Francis DuPont's leadership and Stephen Boudin's design council left a permanent mark. William Seal's histories and the association's archives cover the transformation. The Kittinger Cabinet Room, Suite, delivered in 1970, complete with brass nameplates that turned chairs into ceremonial tokens. The practice of cabinet members taking their chair at the end of service, with signatures under the seat, dates from this era. Kittinger's records and the White House furnishes logs confirm the tradition. Thread these episodes together, and the furniture tells a national story that is both material and psychological. Americans have always argued about taste with the fervor usually reserved for taxation and tariffs. Debates over whether the Blue Room should be more French or more American play out in upholstery choices. Fights over whether the Truman balcony ruined the South portico gave way to the balcony becoming one of the most beloved outdoor rooms in presidential life. The decision to reorient the Great Seal in 1945 sounds minor, until a historian notices the resolute desk panel, still facing the old way, a quiet, visual echo of the moment, policy-adjusted symbolism to suit a post-war world. This is also a story about class and access. Early public receptions opened the house to masses of visitors in a way most European palaces never attempted. Furniture suffered accordingly, which is why Jackson's team favored sturdier woods and construction. Late 19th century receptions piled more people into spaces than the joints of certain chairs appreciated, and the sprung seats remember it. 20th century tours deliver millions across floors each decade. The choice to rope off certain rooms and staff them with docents is as much about saving fabric as it is about preserving mystique. Taste cycles, predictably. The White House rides them at a dignified pace. Mahogany returns after walnut has its day. Damask gives way to silk stripe, to brocatelle, to moiré, and back again. Carpets tilt from floral to geometric to star-spangled federal motifs, always photographed from doorways that anchor the public's collective memory. The aim is reassuring continuity, with subtle variety, the furniture equivalent of a steady hand on the tiller. The backstory that never appears in glamour shots is the constant hunt for authenticity. When the curator's office identifies a candidate for reacquisition, a console table in a private collection, with early records tying it to an 1818 White House invoice, the steps between interest and installation are steep. Legal review confirms ownership status and gift acceptability. Condition assessments determine whether the piece can endure a high-traffic environment. A conservator plans cleaning or structural work. The donor's intent, the historical significance, and the campaign to raise funds, if needed, all converge. In the best moments, an object with a claim to a room returns to find that the room has been waiting for it. Sometimes the collection absorbs losses with grace. Fire took pieces in 1814, and again in 1929. Auctions stripped rooms in 1882. moves damaged more than one fragile secretary or mirror. Replacements followed, guided by scholarship, so the overall narrative stayed legible. The house is not an archaeological site. It is a living institution where state dinners, holiday receptions, and press conferences beat the tempo. The furniture survives because the people who manage it accept that perfection is not the goal. Integrity is. Modern administrations add their lines to the story. Barack Obama's Oval Office rearrangement paired the resolute desk with contemporary art and a muted rug inscribed with quotes, a dialogue between past and present, written in wool and wood. Donald Trump's choices returned gold frames and a bolder palette, another kind of period revival by instinct. Joe Biden's Oval Office keeps the resolute desk and layers in historic busts. Cesar Chavez, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., balancing 19th century woodwork with 20th century moral memory. The furniture remains constant enough to calm, flexible enough to speak. A house that old and that visible becomes an archive of shared myths for a reason. People want to run fingers over the arm of a chair and feel history. They want to imagine Mary Lincoln approving the curve of a sofa, Theodore Roosevelt pounding an eagle-crested arm with his fist, or John and Jackie deciding where a Belanger chair should stand. The facts are more administrative, more patient, and ultimately more powerful. Inventories, conservation reports, and purchase ledgers carry the story onward, one line at a time. The White House furniture outlasts styles, outlasts arguments, and sometimes outlasts reputations. In the end, the White House is a working residence where the furniture earns its keep. It dresses rooms for diplomacy, holds coats in receiving lines, steadies elbows during toasts, and shows the country to itself in polished reflections. It is not a museum in the ordinary sense. It is a stage for the American experiment, with sets that change slowly enough to show continuity and fast enough to stay alive. A gilded armchair in the Blue Room looks like a relic until the President of the United States perches on its edge to greet a guest and turns it, again, into a contemporary object. It all comes back to that Arctic tale. A ship named Resolute got stuck in ice while chasing a vanished expedition. Americans returned it to the British as an act of goodwill. Decades later, the ship became desks. One crossed the Atlantic and landed in the President's house as a gift. Out of ice and planks, a piece of furniture emerged that now anchors a world of myth and sober paperwork. That is how White House furniture works. Wood and fabric absorb impact. Symbolism grows around them. Fashion strips away and returns. Documentation keeps everyone honest. The chairs and tables serve quietly, while oceans and elections move around them. And when a visitor says that a certain chair looks like history, the house smiles a little, because it is. Let's dive into our next piece. The trading networks of the ancient Minoans. Archaeologists kept tripping over the same plot twist in the dirt. Cretan pottery and Cretan-style artwork turning up where nobody would expect it, in the Nile Delta, on the coast of Syria, on the islands dotting the Aegean like stepping stones, and even on the Anatolian shore. This was not a few stray souvenirs. This was a network. Before the Phoenicians trademarked the Bronze Age shipping lane aesthetic, the Minoans already ran a sea-centered economy that stretched from the shores of Egypt to the heel of Greece, from Cyprus to the Cyclades. No coins, no empire in the modern sense, and no alphabet anyone can currently read. And yet, somehow, these islanders moved copper and tin, oil and wine, saffron and purple dye, carved stone vases and painted pottery at a scale that made the Bronze Age feel suspiciously modern. Here comes the pivot that still sparks arguments in conference halls. The Minoans did not leave a single written sentence in a language scholars can read. Their primary script, Linear A, remains a locked file. What survives is everything else. The ships they painted on walls, the warehouses they stacked with gigantic storage jars, the ceilings they slapped onto packages like tamper-evident stickers, the weights they used for calculations, and the trade objects other people buried, broke, or bragged about. That stubborn, physical trail shouts something unmistakable. Crete, in the second millennium BES, ran the Mediterranean's best connected maritime web. Start with a name check. Minoan is not what they called themselves. The label comes from Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist who in 1900 started excavating a sprawling complex at Knossos and decided it looked like the palace of the mythical king Minos. Myth branding does a lot of heavy lifting in archaeology. The civilization on Crete thrived roughly from 2000 to 1450 BES, with earlier roots stretching back to the Neolithic at Knossos, around 7000 BES. The timeline that matters for trade goes like this. First palaces appear around 1900 BES. There's a big expansion after around 1700 BES, a florid high point, about 1500 BES, and then a violent reset around 1450 BES, when Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland step into Cretan administration and scribble with Linear B. That set of dates gives the network a frame. Now visualize the stage. Crete is a long limestone battleship, moored across the middle of the eastern Mediterranean. It sits 200 kilometers south of the Greek mainland, about 120 kilometers from Santorini, Thera, roughly 500 to Tor, 700 kilometers from the Nile Delta, depending on the route, and within a few days sailing of Cyprus and the Levant, when the winds and currents cooperate. The island has microclimates, good harbours on the north and south coasts, olive and grape-friendly hillsides, and an unfortunate lack of copper and tin, the key ingredients of bronze. The deficit turned into motivation. Strong olives, weak metals. That combination breeds long-distance trade, the way a beach breeds driftwood. The palatial centres, Knossos in the north, Phaistos in the Mesara plain of the south, Malia in the north-central coast, and Zakros on the far east, acted like customs houses and central warehouses. Their storerooms still look impressive. In ruin. At Knossos, the West magazines held rows of pithoi, massive storage jars, that stand shoulder high and higher. A single pithos could swallow 1,000 litres, a hallway with dozens tips over, into industrial scale. The floors show cut drain channels and thresholds, worn by generations of traffic. Doorways were secured with wooden bars. Seal impressions record who authorized what. It is paperwork without paper. The system runs on clay. Pieces of that system survive in startling abundance. Thousands of clay ceilings show string marks where packages were tied shut, then sealed with a personalized signet, miniature logos in soft clay that could be checked later for tampering. Linear A tablets list commodities and personnel in tallies that still resist full translation, but the numerals scream accounting at Hagia Triada alone, over 150 linear tablets record distributions of grain and other staples. Balance weights, made of stone, turn up in palace sites and ports. Malia, Knossos, Kartozakros, incised with simple marks. Their masses slot into repeating series. Scholars like William D. E. Coulson and James Petruso noticed that many cluster around units in the 9-10G range and their multiples, echoing Near Eastern shekels and minas. Aegean administration plugged into a Mediterranean habit of weighing value. No coins required, just weight, measure, and credibility enforced by seals and storerooms. None of this matters without boats. Cretan ships appear in wall paintings and glyptic scenes not as doodles, but as bragging rights. The Akrotiri flotilla, fresco on nearby Thera, painted before the island blew itself into a cloud of ash, parades EP's elongated hulls sliding across a blue sea dotted with dolphins. Each ship shows a high prow and stern, a row of oars, a single square sail rigged on a central mast, and sometimes a little cabin built like a hut. Flags flutter. People lean over rails. Scholars estimate lengths of 1725 meters based on proportional analysis. That size equals serious cargo and serious range. The Aegean winds in summer blow from the north as the Etesians. Return trips along island chains get easier with that push. Hug the shore. Rested anchorages like Mochilas, Sierra, Gornia, Porus Katsambas, near Heraklion, Komos Katsambas, near Heraklion, Komos on the south coast, and Kartozakros in the east. Mooring stones, with carved holes at several sites, prove that they tied down real ships, not fantasies. Harbours like Konmos show long, ashlar-walled buildings facing the sea, warehouses in position for direct loading. The earliest hints of a Cretan sea habit predate the palaces. Neolithic and early Bronze Age communities across the Aegean swapped obsidian from the island of Melos by 5,000 Bes. That tells a quiet story of canoes, rowing, and nighttime stars, long before the Cretan palaces built administrative muscle. Early Minoan ceramic styles, like the speckled basiliki ware around 2400, 2200 B, trickle beyond Crete. By the Middle Minoan period, c. 1700 B, the paint job suddenly gets loud. Kamari's ware, a polychrome style with eggshell-thin walls and curving designs in red, white, and orange on a lustrous dark ground, flies off the island. Kamaris cups and jugs show up in Egypt, in the Levant, on islands across the Aegean. Excavations by Flinders, Petri at El Lahau, Kahun, and by others at Lisht and Darsha, pulled Minoan kamares, pieces out of Middle Kingdom contexts, 12th-13th dynasty c. 1900 to 1700 BC. Those are not tourist ashtrays. They testify to early links between Crete and the Nile court. The route likely involved coastal hops to the delta rather than foolhardy open ocean dashes. A polychrome teacup in a pyramid town pantry is a shipping invoice made of clay. Textual hints from the east round out the map. Archives at Mari on the Euphrates dated to the early 18th century BIS mention a place called Kaptara and its merchants. Most scholars map Kaptara to Crete. Egyptian tomb paintings from the New Kingdom, especially the 18th dynasty, depict foreign tribute bearers called Keftiu bringing luxury goods to Thebes. The tomb of Rekhmire, GT10, Vizier under Thutmose III, and Amenhotep II shows men with short kilts and colourful sashes carrying metal vessels, stone vases, and what look like Aegean writer, the famous conical and bull's head pouring vessels, carved in serpentine or made of metal. The labels speak of Kefteu and the islands in the midst of the Great Green Sea. Whether Kefteu means Cretans exclusively or a broader Aegean category remains debated, but the imagery screams Aegean. Egyptian art turned these sea traders into a recognizable brand. Back on Crete, the Second Palace period, after around 1700, B kicks the network into high gear. Building programs surge. At Malia, magazines line up with storage jars fitted to their spaces like appliances in a new kitchen. At Vathipetro, south of Archanes, a late Minoan structure preserves stone presses thought to process grapes and olives. Troughs run for juice or oil. Clay basins sit ready to catch. Olive oil functions as the Bronze Age Swiss army commodity. Lighting, cooking, perfuming, anointing, paying. Wine joins the ride, aged in pithoi and poured into transport jars. A freight economy of liquids turns the island into a refinery with sales. The export catalogue grows familiar. Pottery leads. Kamares ware first, then marine style, around LM, IB, C. 1520-1450 B, with octopuses sprawled across amphora bodies as if hugging them into submission. The craft shows a painter's sense of movement. Tentacles fling themselves over handles. Suction cups dot the surface. The jars almost look alive. These vessels migrate far: Cyclades, Rhodes, the Greek mainland, the Levant, Cyprus. Stone vases with drill-carved bands and ripple patterns head out, along with carved writer in animal forms. Knossos and Zakros, specialized in imported raw materials, turned into things elites wanted to hold. There is ivory, likely from Syria or Egypt, gold sheet and inlays, near transparent gypsum used for floors and wall elements that shine like ice. Egyptian blue faience beads threaded into Cretan ensembles, maybe lapis lazuli beads from Afghanistan, via long Near Eastern caravans that eventually let a little of that midnight blue slip onto Cretan strings. The Minoans import raw glamour and export finished myths. The network does not run on silent exchanges. It advertises itself. The island of Santorini, Thera, specifically the buried town of Akrotiri, preserves walls coated with Aegean frescoes so current that they still feel warm. The saffron gatherers harvest crocus flowers in rocky fields, while a seated goddess watches. Saffron dyes fabric, seasons dishes, and tints medical recipes. Crocus threads also dye profit. Somebody paid for that harvest. The flotilla fresco stages a sea pageant, as if the town itself stars in a commercial for island hopping. The harbour scenes show multi-story buildings with balconies, quayside crowds, and a fleet moving with ceremony. That vision is not merely Cycladic. It is Aegean-wide propaganda for a way of life built on ships and shoreline windows. Trade patterns ripple across the wider pond. In the Cyclades, towns like Aya Irini, on Kea and Hylocopi, on Melos, absorb Minoan fashions. Wall paintings in their buildings adopt Cretan palettes and themes. Pottery styles turn Minoan. On Rhodes, especially at Triander, Ialissos, Minoan forms and motifs appear. On Kythera, the settlement at Castri leans decidedly Cretan. On the Anatolian coast, Miletus shows Minoan-style architecture and fresco fragments in levels dated to the Middle and Late Minoan I period. Those are not foreign ghettos. They look like hybrid local centers tuned to Aegean trade rhythms. Modern scholarship uses the term Minoanization to describe this spread of Cretan-style culture without jumping to heavy-handed colonial narratives. Trade plus glamour plus a touch of religious theatre proves contagious. Egypt picks up the signal in high-definition colour. At Avaris, Tel el-Dabar, in the eastern Nile Delta, excavations directed by Manfred Beitak uncovered rooms painted with Aegean frescoes, bull-leaping scenes, rosettes, griffins, in layers dated to the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, 1470–1430 BC, or slightly earlier. The palette and technique shout Aegean. Whether Cretan artists painted those walls or Egyptian craftsmen learned the style from imported works, the message lands. Egypt commissioned Aegean design for its own elite spaces. That sits alongside Keftiu donations in Theban tombs and jars of Aegean style found in Egyptian contexts. The network reaches right into pharaonic decor. The Levant tells its half in broken shards and palace floors. At Tel Kabri, in northern Israel, a Middle Bronze palace, Seh, 1700 to 1600 B, displayed Aegean-style frescoes, spirals, rosettes, and fragments of figurative scenes, laid over plaster floors. That is Crete's language of decoration, fluently spoken on a Canaanite stage. At Ugarit, Ras Shamra, Cypriot and Aegean ceramics mingle in storerooms as if the harbour called everything in for a party. Byblos, Ashkelon, and Tel El Adjul show Cretan imports or Minoanizing imitations. Across Cyprus, especially at Enkomi and Hala Sultan Teki, Minoan-style ware appears in late bronze layers, with Mycenaean competition arriving later, like a louder neighbour. Cyprus anchors the metals side of the story. The island's Bronze Age identity as Alashia shows up both in the archaeological record and in diplomatic letters, especially the Amarna correspondence of the 14th century Bess. Copper from Cyprus feeds the Eastern Mediterranean forge. Copper ingots, particularly the famous oxhide form, with 4 projecting corners, start appearing in the 16th century B and then flood 14th century shipwrecks like Uluburun. The Uluburun wreck off southern Turkey carried at least 10 tons of copper in 34 oxhide ingots and smaller bun-shaped ingots, alongside about a ton of tin, terebinth resin, glass ingots, ivory, ebony, amber, gold, and silver jewelry, and Canaanite jars, full of what residues identify as wine-based products. That ship sunk in the 14th century, a century after the main Minoan palatial peak, under Mycenaean watch. Even so, it demonstrates what a late bronze cargo looked like when Aegean trade matured. Metals, luxury raw materials, manufactured prestige goods, resins and oils ready to be blended into perfumes, and fine containers for transport. It pictures the world the Minoans helped build. The Minoan role in metals links back to a core reliance. Crete possesses little native copper or tin worth counting. Bronze tools, bronze weapons, bronze ornaments. The whole package depends on importing. Copper came usually from Cyprus or the Anatolian coast. Tin remains the great Bronze Age whodunit. Small amounts in Anatolia show up in archaeometallurgical studies, but the bigger Eastern Mediterranean tin supply likely traveled very far. Central Asia, the Taurus, or even beyond. Recent isotopic work points to sources in Central Asia for some late bronze tin. Other parcels may trace to the Caucasus or Central Anatolia. The exact mix for Minoan Crete remains uncertain, but the import of copper tin into the Aegean becomes a structural fact. That fact builds the whole network's logic. Someone on Crete orchestrated metals in, olive oil, and luxury goods out. Minoan scribes likely recorded deliveries of raw copper. Smiths shaped it into tools and gifts, and palatial officials turned metal and oil into relationships. The scale of administration deserves a closer look because it underwrites confidence in long-distance deals. The palace, as a concept, conjures thrones and ceremonial steps, but the backbone sits in the magazines. Knossos features at least 18 West magazines, with over 100 pithoi originally in place, along with lockable doors and a central courtyard fit for processions and performance. Malia's magazines show similar arrangements. Phaistos crowns, a contrasting hilltop, monumental and airy, with the Messerar plain spread, like a table. Cato Zakros, tucked into a protected bay on the east coast, reads like a distribution terminal. Storerooms, archive rooms with linear A tablets and ceilings, evidence for imported exotica in quantity. Among Zakros finds are lumps of raw materials and objects pointing to craftsmen with wide palettes. The palace at Aya Triada, near Phaistos, turned up an archive of linear A tablets and a wealth of scenes carved in stone and painted on fresco. The famous Chieftain Cup and the Harvest of Vars both ripple with social detail and hints of specialization. The administrative technology stays nimble. Seals abound, carnelian, steatite, agate, cut with scenes of humans, animals, and mythic creatures. These stamps, when pressed into wet clay, left crisp reliefs that fixed identity to transactions. Nodules still show holes and string marks where cords wrapped packages before the press came down. Tablets in linear A list toponyms, personal names, commodities, and numerals in tallies and fractions. The script stays mute on grammar, but the shapes of the numbers and repetition of entries make their function obvious. A civilization perfected the art of managing things and people through small marks and the weight of jars and weights. It even standardized containers. Late Minoan, stirrup jars, with a false spout for sealing and a side spout for pouring, become a Mediterranean-wide practical technology for shipping liquids. Those jars proliferate, especially in the Mycenaean-dominated 13th century, but their prototypes appear earlier in the Minoan repertoire. Their design solves a problem in one elegant ceramic hack: how to transport oil or perfumed liquids with minimal spillage and maximum control over sealing. Here comes a contrarian note that cooled the early 20th century fantasy of a peaceful Pax Minoica. Evans pictured a Cretan thalassocracy, literally a sea power so overwhelming that it needed no walls. Thucydides, writing in the 5th century Bach, Book 1.4, called Minos the first to carve out a navy and rule the seas, sweeping away pirates. The story neatly linked myth to the absence of fortifications at certain sites. Then, archaeology did what archaeology does. It kept digging. Fortification walls turned up in more places and periods than expected. Gornia shows guard towers. Kydonia, Chania, On Crete's west coast bristled with defences in later levels. Mainland sites told of raiding by the very people Cretans traded with. Weapons caches and burn layers smashed the fantasy of a gentle island, utopia brewing wine in peace. The Minoan trading web looks less like a charity drive and more like a highly functional, occasionally cutthroat logistics system embedded in competitive politics. Competitive does not mean disorganized. Consider the flow. Raw materials come in from the east and north. Copper, tin, ivory, semi-precious stones, gold. Local produce heads out. Olive oil, wine, wool, textiles. Crete raised sheep in staggering numbers. Ceramics, carved stone, perfumed oils. Secondary industries fill in. Purple dye production from murex shells turns up at coastal Cretan sites. Palaica Costro and other eastern locales show heaps of murex remains and dyeing installations. Saffron harvest from Thera, and likely Crete feeds colour and medicine. Bees supply honey and wax. Minoan beehive-shaped gold pendants and actual beekeeping installations hint at a honey economy. Perfume production uses olive oil as a base, then steeps herbs and resins. Transport jars travel to the Levant and Egypt with scented value added. Carved wooden furniture with inlays testifies to imported ebony and local style. Kilns hum. Looms clack. The palaces move. Cloth, oil, and specialized crafts, like a Bronze Age Amazon warehouse with better architecture and scarier bulls in the courtyard. Distances turn into schedules, once ship speeds and routing get their nod. Ancient sailing vessels averaged 3-5 knots under good conditions. Coastal hopping along the Aegean islands let crews sleep ashore and repair sails. A run from northern Crete to the Cyclades could take 2 to 3 days in decent summer winds, longer in contrary weather. The leg to roads from eastern Crete spanned about 400 to 400 kilometers, depending on the start. An achievable 2 to 3 day sail with stops. The connection to Egypt likely passed through the Dodecanese and Anatolian coast to the Levant, then down to the Nile Delta, a safer but longer corridor than open sea. Resupply at Eucharit Byblos or Gaza made sense. The sea did not act as a barrier. It served as a conveyor belt with predictable currents and winds. Everyone who mattered learned its logic. This is where the myth of the labyrinth helps, even while being waved away as literal truth. The maze at Knossos, whatever it was in reality. Storerooms, corridors, courtyards, signals, control. Bull-leaping frescoes and writer connect animals to ritual and elite theatre. Ritual, in a society that runs on long-distance relationships, doubles as public policy. Foreigners show up in the court's decorated spaces and witness disciplined spectacles, drink from controlled vessels, and participate in feasts organized by officials who handle the keys to storerooms. The sensory overload is carefully tuned. Perfumes, dyes, carved stone surfaces, light glancing off gypsum floors, all speak of a ruling class with access to exotic supply chains. That performance grants trust in trade. It announces to sailing partners that Crete can deliver. Here comes the first hard mood shift. Sometime around the middle of the second millennium, Bes, the volcano on Thera, erupted. The scale lands off the charts. Radiocarbon dates from an olive tree buried in the eruption, along with ice core data and tree rings. Elsewhere, put the explosion in a window around 1627, 1600 B. Archaeological synchronisms, tied to Egyptian chronology, traditionally favored a later date, around 1525, 1500 BS, though adjustments and debates continue. The ashfall blanketed Thera and left a fingerprint from Crete to Turkey to Egypt. The eruption's local effects on Crete included ash rain and, crucially, likely tsunamis that slammed into the north coast. Sites like Palikastro on Crete's northeast show deposits that look like seawater events, with smashed pottery and marine material thrown inland. The town of Akrotiri on Thera went silent under meters of tephra, preserved like a Bronze Age Pompeii, but emptied of its living residents before the final covering. The network took a hit. One of its key cycladic nodes vanished from the circuit. Reconstruction, relocation, and reconfiguration followed. Minoan culture did not evaporate. The period after the eruption, labeled Late Minoan, Ib, explodes with confident art. Marine-style pottery reaches its zenith. The Cretan presence in the Cyclades and Dodecanese remains visible. Contacts with Egypt, as painted on walls and attested in objects, continue. Aegean-style frescoes at Ava Estate to this post-eruption era. The sense is not one of sudden collapse, but rather of rebalancing. Knossos probably expanded its influence, pressing harder on regional centers. The artistic icon of the era, the octopus jar, feels like a stubborn claim of continuity, sea life swagger pasted onto amphora rounds. Then fire arrived on Crete, around 1450 Bach. Most of the major palatial centers burned. Archaeologists label the destruction horizon LMI. Palatial buildings at Phaistos, Malia, Kato Zakros, and other sites show violent ends. Knossos survives this wave, only to later adopt Mycenaean administrative practices, including the writing system Linear B used for Greek. Whether a mainland conquest rolled through, or some combination of internal strife, and opportunistic mainlanders piled on, the net effect concentrates power at Knossos under Achaean managers. The centers that had anchored networks on the island shrink or fall silent. The Cretan trade web threads with Greek mainland elites at the helm. Evidence of Greek mainlanders enjoying Minoan art long before the takeover gives context. Burials in grave circles A and B at Mycenae, C. 1600 to 1500 BC glow, with imported or Minoan-style goods, gold cups with bull scenes, the famous Fafio cups from near Sparta show, bull capture in a style that screams Cretan finesse, stone vases carved with the rippling drill technique, and imported camarays and later wares. Mainland palaces adopt the Megaron floor plan, but fill their storerooms with the same logic of sealed pots and weighed goods. The transition from Minoan to Mycenaean dominance and Aegean dominance in Aegean trade looks less like a light switch and more like a baton pass in a long race. The track remains salt water. That baton pass ripples in Egyptian art. Keftil figures bearing gifts linger on tomb walls once the Mycenaeans control Knossos. Egypt's artists did not update their glossary with academic precision. They kept painting Aegean traders with the same label. The jars, vases, writer, and metalwork in the scenes blend Cretan and Mycenaean styles as decades roll. The Keftiu brand outlived the Minoan palace world and rolled forward under new management. This is a habit of empires and economies everywhere. Logos persist after corporate takeovers. The Bronze Age did it long before brand consultants sent invoices. Here's the striking part of the Minoan trading web when viewed at full zoom. This was not a centralized empire with governors in every port. The evidence points to a rough federation of palatial centers on Crete, ringed by partner sites along the Cyclades, Dodecanese, and Anatolian coast. Some of those partners show deep Cretan cultural layers. Others feature selective Minoanization. Ship captains likely came from many places, not just Crete. Canaanite traders ran their own circuits. Cypriot merchants specialized in copper. The Levant shipped wine and glass. Egypt pulled prestige goods from everywhere, while sending gold and grain in return. The Minoans excelled at sitting precisely where the Mediterranean's conveyor belts crossed, building a flexible administrative technology that interfaced easily with formats from Syria to the Nile. The catalogue of hard evidence reads like a greatest hits of how to prove a network without a memoir. Imported Minoan pottery in Egypt, Kamaras ware in Middle Kingdom sites, like El Lahan and Abydos. Later, Aegean jars in New Kingdom contexts. Specific vessels carry telltale motifs and manufacturing techniques traceable under a microscope. Aegean-style frescoes in foreign palaces, Avaris's bull leapers and griffins, Tel Cabri's spirals and rosettes, Egyptian depictions of Aegean/Kefti envoys in Theban tombs, Reckmeyer, PT 100, Senenmut, PT 71, Useramon, PT 71, and others in the 18th dynasty, bearing vessels that match Aegean forms. Minoan presence on islands and Anatolia, Aiaia Irene, Kia, Philocope, Melos, Trianda, Rhodes, Castri, Kythera, and Meletos, Anatolia, with Minoanized architecture and art. Port infrastructure. Kamos on Crete's south coast, with long halls suspected as magazines oriented toward the beach. Karto-Zakros with a palace, practically hugging a bay. Seira and Moshlos, with built harbour installations. Administrative hardware. Linear A tablets and ceilings at Knossos, Hogia Triada, and Karto-Zakros that list commodities and record Hagia Triada, and Karto-Zakros that list commodities and record transactions in a standardized format. Balance weights that match Near Eastern standards in series. Art reflecting maritime prominence. The Akrotiri flotilla fresco. Countless seals with ships and marine life. Marine-style pottery dominating Lem-Ib distribution. Industrial installations. Olive and grape presses at Vatipetro. Purple dye evidence at coastal sites. Large pithos storerooms at multiple palaces. Loom weights in abundance. Exotic raw materials in Minoan contexts. Ivory tusks and worked ivory. Egyptian, faience, semi-precious stones, occasional amber from the Baltic found in Aegean graves, even possible traces of tin ore or ingot pieces in workshop areas. The Ulubrun shipwreck as a window into the matured system, of which Minoans were early architects. Metals in enormous quantities, perfumed oils, glass, resins, luxury artworks, grares, and standardized transport jars. Each piece by itself whispers possibilities. Put together, the chorus gets loud. The Minoans built, maintained, and styled a network that prioritized smooth exchange. That alone would be impressive. The way they kicked it into culture takes the whole thing next level. Frescoed sea processions, bull-leaping bravado, goddess scenes with saffron gatherers, octopuses wrapping jars. This is merchandising without a price tag. Aegean art, in palace after palace, turned trade goods into prestige objects draped in sacred aura. Oil jars doubled as ritual vessels. Writer turned pouring into ceremony. Stone vases felt heavy in the hand and expensive in the eye. The Minoans did not just ship things. They shipped experience. The machinery behind the scene kept it honest. Weights in the 9-10G unit range, and their multiples show a habit of regular calibration. The distribution of those weights across Crete and outlying sites points to a community of practice. Traders in the Levant would immediately understand the scale. Seal impressions demonstrate control and accountability. The repetition of specific sign groups on linear tablets across different sites indicates not just literacy, but standard bureaucracy. Redistributive economies, where central agencies take in staples and prestige goods, then send them out as rations or rewards, often get caricatured as pre-market. The Minoan version feels more like a hybrid. Palaces function as massive brokers and certifiers. Alongside that central system, private or semi-private entrepreneurs probably made deals and ran ships. The mix lands similar to a modern port authority, plus key logistics companies operating under the same roof, one stamped with symbols of sovereign ritual power. The network's nodes on Crete connect to their own hinterlands. Knossos looks north, to Amnisos and the bays of the north coast, Mauryan to its local plain, and perhaps a port at Poros, Katsambas, acting as Knossos's main harbour, Phaistos to Komos, and the Messara's agricultural base, Kartozakros base, Kartozakros, to a maritime sphere that reaches east towards Cyprus and the Levant. Towns like Gornia, Mochlos, Psira, and Palaiokastro ring the island with smaller harbours and craft districts. Roads link them to palaces. Some roads are still visible as stone-paved processional ways. Peak sanctuaries cap mountains with shrines that watch lines of movement. The island becomes an instrument tuned to take goods in, refine and redistribute them, and send them out again in better forms. There is a final feature of the Minoan network that modern audiences recognize immediately because it made the map bigger than ships alone. Culture traveled as eagerly as cargo. Religious symbols, double axes, labries, horns of consecration, snake-bearing goddesses appear in miniature in Cycladic houses. Administrative routines, ceilings, weights, storage forms adopt similar patterns beyond Crete. Musicians and painters moved not only goods. The Avaris frescoes likely involved Aegean painters transported south for a project. Tel Cabri's floors and walls show that local teams imported not just motifs, but the technique of plastering and pigment mixing. This is the soft power part of the network. A sea of islands fosters shared styles, and Crete provided an extremely compelling one at exactly the historical moment when ships got big and networks got dense. The afterlife of all this commerce sticks to language and myth in faint outlines. The Bible mentions Captor as a place from which people came to Philistia. Many have identified Captor with Crete. Egyptian Kaftiu carried Aegean goods. Thucydides later wrote of Minos' sea rule. Homer, in the Odyssey, spun tales of many-peopled Crete. None of these texts offer ledger books, but they show what ancient memory did with a lively, sea-linked island. It made the place mythic. The labyrinth and the Minotaur endure because the network worked. A society that specialized in moving things made itself the thing that stories kept moving as well. One last, deflationary but important correction sneaks in. Great trade networks generate wealth, but they also depend on coercion and contingency. A stalwart bronze blade, fashioned in Knossos' workshop, might go to a friend or a raider. Ship crews sometimes traded, and sometimes fought, depending on whose ship it was, and how many oars stuck out of the hull. Aegean sailors and Near Eastern merchants both competed and collaborated on the same beaches. Egyptian inscriptions often list Asiatics, Keftiu, and other groups together in contexts that mix diplomacy and threat. The Minoan world did not float above all that. It rode the waves like everyone else, sometimes elegant, sometimes ruthless. The punchline lands clean. The Minoans engineered a world in which olive oil counted as currency in the right form. Purple dye smelled like profits, stone vases signaled status, and ships stitched together distances that had intimidated earlier centuries. Their palaces perfected the math of jars and weights. Their frescoes sold a lifestyle that entire coastlines tried to copy. Their pots and practices reached from the Nile's reed beds to Anatolia's headlands, from Cyprus's copper towns to the Cycladic harbours that spread like a pearl necklace. When the volcano rocked the middle of the Aegean and the Mycenaeans later rearranged the board, the network flexed, bent, and finally rebuilt under new managers. The lines on the sea did not vanish. They stayed and multiplied. Archaeology, with its comfortable love of fragments and context, confirms this without needing a single deciphered paragraph in Minoan hand. Kamares ware in an Egyptian storeroom, a conical rhyton in a Canaanite palace, balance weights that align to a standard, and a flotilla of painted ships curving around a Cycladic wall together tell a coherent story. It is a story of connectivity achieved with wood and canvas, clay and ceilings, rituals and warehouse schedules. It is also a lesson in how aesthetics and administration fuse. The Minoans married spreadsheet, thinking to ceremony, and sold both as a package called civilization. A skeptical aside slides in for the obsessively curious. The exact start and the exact end remain fuzzy, and details will never align into a crisp business plan. Debates about the date of the Thera eruption will continue. Back and forth over whether Keftiu exclusively means Crete will survive. Arguments about whether Minoan colonies stood where Minoanized communities actually blossomed will keep grad students caffeinated. None of that cancels the central shape. The Minoan trading networks look like the Eastern Mediterranean's first large, integrated, brand-conscious, weight-calibrated sea system. It may not have invented shipping, but it made shipping look good. On some quiet evening in the early second millennium bus, a crew probably left Komos with a small cargo. Oil in pithoi strapped down with ropes, wine jugs wedged with plant fibre, a carved stone vase, or two wrapped in cloth, maybe a handful of saffron jars, smelling like a fortune. The ship eased past the dunes, then headed east along the coast under an evening land breeze. Stars tilted into visibility. Experienced eyes read them like a familiar slate. The crew, not particularly philosophical, counted oars and swore about the sail. They also counted on a network that would feed them, pay them, and deliver them to a harbour where Cretans, Cycladians and Levantines all spoke the same languages of weight, storage, and signet. That predictability, built up transaction by transaction over centuries, turned the Aegean from a tricky set of waters into a cultural highway. Crete's palatial storerooms have long since emptied. The pithoi rest cracked and silent. But the octopus jars still hold their grip in museum glass. The avarus frescoes flake in climate-controlled labs. The ceilings, thousands of them, rest in trays where curatorial interns wince at static. Linear A still dodges decipherment like a smug password. The evidence remains relentless. It draws a line across an ancient map. Cretan harbours to Cycladic towns, to Anatolian headlands, to Cypriot copper towns, to Levantine palaces, and down to Egyptian courts. And it inks that line repeatedly, in red, black, ochre, and indigo. Archaeology rarely hands out compliments. In this case, it granted Crete the one prize that actually matters in history. Proof of connection strong enough to leave traces in other people's houses. The Minoans earned that prize, the old-fashioned way, by building a system that shipped not just goods, but order and style. Later cultures adopted, adapted, and outdid them. None erased them. Their trading networks set the rhythm. The Aegean has danced to variations of that rhythm ever since. Let's dive into our next piece. The rise of the Mauryan Empire, Ashoka's reign. Blood hung over the Kalinga plain, like a bad decision. The years sat around 261 BC, and the count, recorded not by gossip or epic poetry, but by the emperor's own granite confession, landed hard. 100,000 killed, 150,000 deported, and many times that number dead from famine and disease. Ashoka, fresh from victory, stood over the wreckage and did something ancient kings did not do. He changed direction. He turned the thunder of drums of conquest, Beriosa, into the sound of Dhamma. That line comes straight off his major rock edict to Rednite, an official press release engraved in stone. No palace spin doctors, no palace spin doctors, no prior interns. Just an emperor with a chisel, announcing to anyone who could read Brahmi or Koroshti that war had extracted a cost he could not swallow again. That pivot lands better when the origin story gets its due. This was not a soft empire to begin with. The Mauryan state exploded onto the North Indian scene in the late 4th century, Bess, like a startup with immediate unicorn energy. Chandragupta Maurya, likely in his 20s, toppled the Nanda dynasty in Magadha around 321 B. The Nandas had money, lots of it. Greek sources loved to repeat unsourced flexes about their treasury. Chandragupta had something better. A strategist who read governance like a playbook. Chanakya, known to Sanskritists as Kartilya, and to bookish power nerds as the mind behind the Arthashastra. That text would later be edited and compiled, probably centuries after his lifetime, but its content screams Mauryan style. Spies, taxes, irrigation, elephants, the works. Think ruthless rationality, wrapped in moral realism. Ramila Thapar calls this an early state that scaled up with breathtaking speed, and the analytics back her up. Chandragupta's rise is anchored in tangible data points. Around 305 BC, he and Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander the Great's successor kings, met in a grinding frontier struggle. Seleucus wanted the eastern edge of Alexander's legacy. Chandragupta wanted all of northern India and the northwest gateways. The treaty they signed did not emerge from an airy poet's imagination. Ancient Greek accounts, Strabo, Arrian, Plutarch, report Seleucus ceded territories, Arachosia, Paracamisidae, and likely Gedrosia, in exchange for 500 war elephants and a marriage alliance. The 500 elephants are not trivia. Those tusked tanks changed the math at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 base, where Seleucus used them to pummel rivals. Chandragupta's diplomacy literally marched into Hellenistic world history. In the emperor's capital, Pataliputra, modern Patna, the scale looked industrial. Megasthenes, Seleucus's envoy, parked himself there around 300 buys and took notes that survive in later authors like Diodorus and Strabo. He described a city 80 stadia long and 15 wide, call it, roughly 15 kilometers by 2.8 kilometers, wrapped in a timber palisade with 570 towers and 64 gates. If that sounds like a spreadsheet in wood and mud, archaeology agrees. Excavations at Qumrahar revealed the ghostly footprint of an 80-column pillared hall, each column of polished sandstone, the famous Mauryan polish that gleamed like lacquer. The empire ran on rivers, roads, and record-keeping. Chandragupta's successors kept the throttle down. Bindusara reigned c. 297, 273 BC, known to Greek writers as a Matroshat, slayer of foes, pushed Mauryan control deep into the Deccan. Envoys kept the inbox busy. Dimachus of Plataea came from Antiochus, Isai. Ptolemy Philadelphus reportedly dispatched Dionysius to Pataliputra. The trade corridors lit up, from Taxila in the northwest, through the Ganges plain to the ports at Tamralipti on the Bay of Bengal. Goods, gossip, and tax receipts moved like arterial blood. Into this machine stepped Ashoka, Bindusara's son, sometime around the 260 SB. Legends painted him as both ruthless and enlightened. Chandashoka before the conversion, Dharmashoka after, and those tales read like moral theatre. The Buddhist Divyavadana claimed a palace massacre of brothers. The number 99 inches became a dramatic baseline in later stories. Evidence from inscriptions stays politely silent on that. What can be pinned down? Ashoka's coronation rests around 269, 268 BES, his reign to about 232 BES. He likely served as viceroy at Ujjain, a crucial western node. A Taxila revolt simmered. Stories credit him with putting it down. Whether he needed all the big bad energy of the later legends or simply applied Mauryan logistics, with a cold hand, the throne ended up his. Then came Kalinga. That stretch of coast in present-day Odisha had escaped Mauryan control under Chandragupta and Bindusara. It sat on trade lanes that reached Southeast Asia and looked at the Bay of Bengal like an open cash drawer. Ashoka took it in his 8th regnal year, which lines up to 261 BICE for the battle. The aftermath glows in bleak lines on rock faces at places like Shahbazgari and Jinnah. The numbers are his own. 100,000 killed, 150,000 deported. The kicker, many times that number perished. He states he felt deep remorse. That admission moves the history needle from conquest porn to political ethics. Modern historians like Nyanjot Lahiri and Upinder Singh caution against reading total pacifism into this pivot. The edicts still threaten punishment for lawbreakers and forest people who defy authority. This was not a surrender of sovereignty. It was a recalibration of what power should aim for. Ashoka's answer got one word: Dhamma. Not sectarian dogma. Not a forced conversion scheme. A house style of conduct he carved across the subcontinent in Prakrit, using scripts that met people where they lived. Brahmi in the heartland, Kharosthi in the northwest, and even Greek and Aramaic in Afghanistan. The man literally went multilingual. At Kandahar, a bilingual Greek-Aramaic edict turned his moral memos into Mediterranean-friendly prose. In Major Rock Edict 2, he bragged about planting medicinal herbs for humans and animals, digging wells, and lining roads with banyans and mangoes. Infrastructure and ethics in one breath. A governance flex dressed as compassion. The operational details in those edicts land like a CEO's all-hands email, except chiseled. Major Rock Edict I lists a kitchen policy. Once, many animals were killed daily. Now, only 3 survived the chopping block. 2 peacocks and a deer, and even the deer not regularly. He promised to end even that. Pillar Edict V dropped a long list of creatures not to be killed and ordered fish and game restrictions. This was not vegan utopia. It was targeted reduction. He made the court stop the sacrificial slaughter trend. He made killing animals unfashionable around him, at least. He redesigned the state's relationship to its subjects without dumping the state itself. Dhammamatas officials of morality appear in Major Rock Edict V as a new cadre appointed in year 13. Their brief went beyond bureaucratic box-ticking. They mediated sect disputes, oversaw welfare for prisoners and the poor, and handled cross-border relations of goodwill. Pillar Edict V grants a 3-day reprieve to condemned prisoners, so families could appeal, or the condemned could perform meritorious acts. An emperor who paused execution so someone could earn spiritual credit reads like a paradox. But the edicts are explicit. Religious politics took a rare, tolerant turn. Major Rock Edict, the sign urges respect among all sects. Ashoka publicly warned against praising one's own sect by slandering another. That is not the standard script of imperial piety. He did clearly back Buddhism as a personal path. The Pali chronicles, like the Mahvamsa and the Sanskrit Ashoka paint him as a sponsor of the Third Buddhist Council at Pataliputra, guided by the monk Moggaliputta Tissa around c. 250 BC. That council allegedly compiled the Kathavathu to weed out doctrinal freeloaders. Some scholars treat that council story as partly hagiographic, but the edictal and inscriptional trail shows Ashoka visiting and marking Buddhist sites. He went to Lumbini, the Buddha's birthplace, and left a pillar inscription at Ramande in 249 bags, noting a tax reduction to 1/8 for the villagers. He also commemorated the enlargement of a stupa dedicated to the earlier Buddha, Konakamana, at Nigali Saga. These were not anonymous endowments. The inscriptions give his new favorite title, Devanampya Piyadasi, beloved of the gods, he who looks with affection. The brand management ran on stone. Missions followed. The Sri Lankan chronicles claim he sent his son Mahinda and daughter Sangamita to the island kingdom of Anantapura during the reign of Devanampia Tissa. A sapling of the Bodhi tree supposedly crossed the sea and took root. Archaeology at Anuradhapura includes a venerable Bodhi tree with a chain of tradition that reaches back to those accounts. Whether that sapling arrived with a formal Mauryan shipping invoice is less important than the fact that Sri Lanka's Buddhism remembers Ashoka as the imperial cousin who bolted their lineage to the subcontinent's main trunk. The edicts themselves mention foreign frontiers by name. In Major Rock Edicts 2 and 3 in 7, he lists the Cholas, Pandyas, Satyaputras, Keralaputras, and Tamrapani, Sri Lanka, and he throws a shout-out to Greek kings, Antiochos, likely Teos, Ptolemy, Philadelphus, Antigonos to Kononos to Gonatas, Magas of Cyrene, and Alexander, likely of Epirus. He did not rule those lands. He wanted something weirder, the export of moral suasion. He claimed that Dhamma had made an impression there, the ancient world's first ethics influencer, effectively. Carved communication turned into an art form. The stone pillars he planted across the plains stood 12 to 15 meters high, chunked out of tuna sandstone, shining with the high-gloss Mauryan polish. The capitals sat like jewelry on a massive arm, lions, bulls, and elephants, Achaemenid style, but locally remixed. The Sarnath lion capital, with 4 back-to-back lions, and a wheel motif beneath, rose in the 3rd century BC, and now stares from modern India's national emblem. The Ashoka chakra that runs 24 spokes on the Indian flag draws its power from this visual lexicon. These were not vanity projects alone. They were literal geotagged messages. The Kalinga edicts at Dhauli and Jorgada speak softly to local officers, to Sali and Samapa, about compassion for the conquered just a few years after carnage. The elephant carved at Dhauli stands like a stone conscience emerging from rock. Administrative wiring reached deep. The empire's map chopped into provinces with capitals at Taxila in the northwest, at Ujjain in the northwest, Ujjain in the west, Tosali in Kalinga, and Suvarnagiri in the Deccan, with Pataliputra as the brain. Provincial governors, often royals, handled local storms. The official class, Mahamatars, ran revenue, justice, and oversight. Kartala's Arthashastra, while not an Ashoka-era instruction manual, carved on bumper stickers, sketched the logic that Mauryan governance embodied, a land revenue system that took roughly 1/6 of agricultural produce as tax, state monopolies or heavy regulation on mines, forests, salt, and trade routes, and a spy service that read like espionage before bond. The treatise talks about planting informers in markets and monasteries, the use of courtesans as intelligence channels, and sting operations to test officials. Historians caution that the Arthashastra's final redaction may be centuries later, but the Mauryan footprint in archaeology and inscriptions lines up with a state that loved information. Scale demanded muscle. Greek writers threw out staggering military numbers. In some accounts, the Mauryas fielded 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, 8,000 chariots, and 9,000 elephants. Even if those are inflated, the army held a footprint that devoured resources. It policed an empire spanning from Afghanistan and Pakistan across the Ganges Plain to Bengal and deep into peninsular India, stopping short of the southern Tamil kingdoms that kept their independence but stayed on the trade chat. That reach shows in punch-marked coins spread across the subcontinent and in the uniformity of certain weights. The Mauryan mint did not stamp emperors' faces. These were not Hellenistic tetradrachms. The coins carried symbols and patterns, the state's confidence running under the radar. The economy pulsed in more than taxes. Agriculture rode monsoon rhythms and irrigation tweaks. The Ganges Plains alluvium paid the bills. Trade moved from Central Asia through Taxila to the east, down south, to the Deccan and out to Sri Lankan and perhaps Southeast Asian ports. The empire built rest houses and dug wells alongside roads. Major Rock Edict 2 mentions medicinal plants planted for animals and men, not just at home, but also in the territories of the Yonas and other neighbors, because Ashoka was in a giving mood, and also in a branding mood. He put banyans in the ground for shade, long before highways had toll plazas. He kept his personal pride low-key. In one weird way, he almost never used his own name. The edicts speak as Devanampir Piyadasi. Only a few inscriptions, like the minor rock edict at Maski and the one at Gujarat, pop the name Ashoka clearly. That anonymity played a historic prank. For centuries, Indian and foreign scholars knew about Piyadasi but did not connect him to Ashoka of Buddhist lore. Then, in 1837, James Prinsep cracked the Brahmi script. Those scratches on boulders turned into sentences. Ashoka emerged like a ghost in high resolution. Alexander Cunningham followed 19th century archaeology's map to pillars and sites. John Marshall took Sanchi from near-forgotten heaps to glorious railings, and the Ashoka story stepped back into time with voice and address. That voice never abandoned. State power. The same rock inscriptions that preach tolerance carry lines that bring reality back. In Major Rock Edict Krensis, after the compassion for Kalinga's dead, the emperor warns that the forest people will not be spared if they refuse to be calmed. In Major Rock Edict 3, he scolds officials for negligence and commands swift action. In Pillar Edict 5, he summarizes his Dhamma while reminding everyone who is in charge. This was not the abolition of coercion. It was its taming. He also did not freeze the empire into Buddhist marble. His patronage extended to Ajivikas, an ascetic sect whose metaphysics spun on fate and austerity. The Barabar Hill caves in Bihar, with mirror-smooth interiors, carry inscriptions attributing their dedication to Ajivikas by Ashoka and his grandson Dasharatha. The Lomas Rishi cave presents a carved facade with curving arch and barrel roof simulation that would echo in later Indian rock-cut architecture. Multiple streams flowed through his empire's religious life. Brahmanical ritual Sramana movements like Buddhism and Jainism, Ajivika fatalists, and rural cults that never asked anyone in Pataliputra for approval. Bureaucracy went hand in hand with conscience. The edicts mention quinquennial and triennial tours, where Ashoka and his officials met people, listened to petitions, and handed out amnesties. He said he wanted promptness in dispensing justice. He fired off a classic emperor move in Pillar Edict V. He took credit for doing all this like a hyperactive project manager. While that might sound like bragging, it lines up with administrative depth. Provincial capitals, district officers, village headmen, scribes tracking crops and cattle. This was not a palace with a throne and a parade. It was a spreadsheet with a subclause about ethics carved into a million NB database. The art and architecture announce Mauryan reach even where texts fall silent. The polish on those pillars and statues likely borrowed technique from Achaemenid Persia, where stone surfaces gleamed under imperial builders like Darius and Xerxes. The motif of animals in procession on a baki, lions, elephants, bulls, horses, reads like an imperial bestiary, a coded language of sovereignty and abundance. The monolithic pillars, transported dozens or hundreds of kilometers and planted with surgeon precision, mock anyone who imagines ancient India as a land of village republics only. This was giant state engineering that moved mountains to deliver moral TED Talks in situ. Complexity dogged the man's personal narrative. Buddhist texts loved the two Ashoka storyline, early cruelty, later compassion, because it reads like a morality play. Modern historians keep a foot on the brake. He certainly fought Kalinga. He certainly felt remorse. He certainly stopped sacrifices at court, ordered medical care, and promoted kindness to servants, elders, and slaves. But the army marched on, the prisons did not close, and the empire did not dissolve into ashrams. His renunciation of Digvijaya, conquest by violence, did not mean a renunciation of Vigraha, the readiness for war, in everything. He invented Dhammavijaya, victory through ethics and persuasion, which probably worked better on roads, ports, and tax-paying farmers than on border raiders. He did philanthropy like a policy wonk. In Rock Edict 2, he says he sent envoys with medicines and herbs to his neighbors, including the realms of the Yonas, because animals and humans everywhere mattered. In Rock Edict Higgs, he takes aim at empty rituals and pomp and insists on practical morality. Obedience to mother and father, generosity to friends, kindness to servants. Pillar Edict V names the creatures that shall not be killed, and the times when hunting and fishing are banned, and it sets out the appointment of superintendents to enforce these. He even details regulations for animal husbandry, like the branding of bulls and breeding periods. That sounds suspiciously like a handbook for a Ministry of Cattle Affairs. He took pilgrimages. That would set Instagram on fire if phones had existed. Lumbini in 249 Bais, with a tax holiday to match the piety. Ode Gaya Sarnath and Kushinaga sit on his itinerary in the chronicles. He distributed relics, according to the Ashoka Vedana, to 84,000 stupas across his empire. That number likely signals a lot in ancient rhetorical math. But the material record of early stupas at Sanchi Bahut and other sites anchors the tradition. Later railings and gateways at Sanchi date mostly to the Shunga and Satavahana periods, but the core mound at Stupa 1 likely started under Ashoka, a small, early dome that later generations ringed with sculpted stone and narrative panels. He also had a content strategy that would make a social media manager take notes. The rocks and pillars went into specific landscapes. Khalsi in the Himalayan foothills, Shabazgar in the Himalayan foothills, Shabazgar and Mansehra in the northwest, with Kharosthi script for the Indo-Iranian interface. Jinnah in Gujarat, monitoring the western trade routes, Sapara near Mumbai's ancient coast, Eragudi in Andhra, Dhauli and Jugarda in Kalinga to announce remorse and reforms where blood had run. The inscriptions adapted to local speech habits, allowing Prakrit dialects to ride the message home. He then free-trialed Greek and Aramaic at Kandahar for that cosmopolitan audience. The message travelled in stone and through envoys beyond the imperial zip code. This balanced fantasy of hard power and soft ethics did not outlive him intact. Ashoka died around 232 Bas, and the gears began to grind. His grandson Dasharatha issued a few inscriptions dedicating caves to Ajivikas, then the names blur. Puranic lists of later Mauryan kings string together Salasuka, Devavarman, Satardhanvan, and finally Brihadratha. In 185 Bes, according to most reconstructions, Brihadratha took a royal parade and got removed from the living world by his own general, Pushyamitra Sunga. The Mauryan skyline crashed into a regional mosaic again. Greeks from Bactria peered over the northwest. A king named Demetrius crossed into the subcontinent. Later, Menander, Milind, would spar with the monk Nagasena in a philosophically flavoured dialogue preserved in the Milindapan. The Mauryan centre had held for a century. Then it learned imperial biology. Big states shed weight or split. The causes of decline come with historian caution tape. Textual fog, archaeology's patchy coverage, and later sectarian storytelling all tug in different directions. Overextension likely hurt. Governing far-flung provinces with variable loyalty demanded expensive armies. Local elites who tolerated Mauryan oversight with Ashoka's charisma might not have felt the same way about his successors. The moral pivot may have sidelined aggression, just enough to let peripheral churn build pressure. Or the usual post-founder syndrome took over. Institutions outlived personal authority, but not by much. Either way, an empire that had once listed the names of foreign kings on its rocks fell to a palace coup within 2 generations. The residue, though, ran deep. Ashoka's stone musings slept in forests, fields, and villages until the 19th century when Prinsep read them aloud in modern script. Indian nationalists saw in him a ruler who made peace and welfare statecraft. The 4 lions of Sarnath climbed onto the Republic of India's emblem. In 1950, the wheel motif, 24 spokes of Dharma, spun onto the flag. Schools taught the Kalinga remorse as a civilizational pivot. Scholars complicate that story with nuance, and nuance makes it better. Ashoka preached tolerance among sects, while backing one. He cut back royal animal slaughter, but did not ban everyone from eating meat. He renounced conquest by blood, but did not forget how to police borders. He carved his policy memos on unforgiving rock, because he expected them to be read long after the court. Poets switched topics. The earlier Mauryan chapter deserves as much applause because it explains how his turn could matter at scale. Chandragupta built an imperial skeleton with nerves and arteries, a land revenue base, a disciplined army, fortified cities, a diplomatic reach from the Indus to the Ganges to the Aegean, echo chamber. Bindusara pushed that skeleton toward the Deccan, swallowing regional polities that had their own long histories. Governance ran, not by hope, but by receipts. Officials tracked irrigation and measured fields. State forests came under supervision. Roads got inspectors. Megasthenes reported 7. Specialized councils in Pataliputra, managing everything from industry to foreigners to recording births and deaths. Even if Greek writers loved a clean schematic, the administrative class the edicts mention looks busy enough to make that plausible. That skeleton that Ashoka reduced cruelty without reducing capacity. He could order shade trees planted and wells dug because labor crews and supervisors existed who knew where to plant and dig. He could announce a 3-day execution reprieve because prisons tracked sentences and wardens followed orders. He could get a Greek-Aramaic bilingual edict inscribed in Kandahar because scribes who knew those languages worked for or with the state. He could send messengers to Antiochos too, because the empire had diplomats on call and trade winds on its side. He also had an aesthetic to match the policy. The so-called Mauryan polish on pillars and figures reflects a technology of finishing stone surfaces that, according to art historians like John Irwin and later critics, may have drawn from Persian techniques, improved locally and used rigorously. The animal capitals, with their fluted bell basses, and Abakia, borrow Achaemenid grammar, but speak in Indian accent. Even the choice of animals carries messages. The lion as sovereignty, and the Buddha's voice at Sarnath. The lion as sovereignty, and the Buddha's voice at Sarnath. The elephant as wisdom and princely power. The bull as fertility and dharma. The polished black stone Mauryan sculptures, like the Didargan Yakshi, stand as icons of material culture that glowed even in dim palace light. The memory of his ethics also travelled far beyond sermons. The policy to limit hunting, stop sacrifices in the palace, and regulate slaughter sits like the earliest known animal welfare law of such scope. Rock Edicti gives a concrete kitchen policy shift. Rock Edicta II turns environmental engineering into a royal duty. Later, empires in India would discuss dharma in many forms, but very few carved detailed lists, naming fish species off limits during breeding seasons. Pillar Edict V does that, dropping lines about halting the killing of certain animals during specific months and restricting castration of animals to certain seasons with a brand to mark them. Micromanagement met morality, right there on stone. The Kalinga War's psychic crater became the cautionary tale that scholars keep returning to, because the casualty figures do not come from inflated legends. They come from a king burning with solemnity. Major Rock Edict, 7th, stands alone in global ancient history, where a conqueror celebrates not his triumph, but his grief. He used that grief to pivot from violent expansion to consolidating an empire on moral glue. He broadcast Dharma as a common code, honor for parents and teachers, truthfulness, restraint, generosity, respectful, listening, sympathetic treatment of servants and slaves, care for prisoners, and religious civility. He tasked officers to do this across provinces. He wanted monks and brahmanas treated with respect. He ordered mango groves and banyans planted along highways. He sent medicinal herbs to neighbors. He kept the army, but changed the anthem. He also kept receipts on the edges. The forest tribes that do not calm down get warnings. Officials who slacked off got public scoldings. The ideal bureaucrat had empathy and a timesheet. The ideal citizen paid taxes and didn't gloat about their sect. The ideal king carved all this into rocks tall enough to intimidate a bored teenager on a long walk. Entire moral universes got pinned like butterflies onto granite, each with regional dialect vibes. Not all his stones stand in India today. Shahbazgari and Mansehr sit in modern Pakistan. The Kandahar bilingual edicts lie in Afghanistan. His world spilled over modern borders because his roots predated them and will outlast them. He lived in a century where Seleucid kings, Ptolemaic pharaohs in Alexandria, Antigonids in Macedonia, and Magus in Cyrene read dispatches about India. He answered by sending medical herbs and moral memos instead of armies. He did that partly because he had done the army thing and counted the bodies himself. The myths that grew around him after he died, read like literary fan fiction, grounded in a core of fact. The 99 brothers executed the miraculous stories of relic distribution, the dramatic repentance, the building of 84,000 stupas in a burst of imperial frenzy. Those got preserved because narrative drama travels farther than wheat yield data. Modern historians separate those with scalpels of skepticism, not to kill wonder but to save it from overreach. The inscriptions never lie to that basic science. They give his voice in contemporary words, with dates by Regmal years, with places named, with officials addressed. When a myth aligns with an inscription, it gets a green light. When it floats, it stays a maybe. The decline after his death often gets lazily blamed on Dhamma. The real reasons look more human. Succession politics turned messy. Dasharatha and later kings carried less clout. Local satraps, call them provincial governors, saw opportunity. The army that glued the borders cost more than a moral economy could easily afford. The geopolitical tide shifted. By 185 bets, Pushyamitra Sangha had rebranded the power centre in Pataliputra. Mauryan pillars outlasted Mauryan policy. Yet the legacy kept surfacing, century after century. In Sri Lanka, the Bodhi tree story became a national saga. In Buddhist narratives across Asia, Ashoka became a model of righteous kingship, Chakravartin, the wheel-turner who rules by Dharma. In India's modern era, his pillars and lions became state iconography. The Ashoka chakra turned into the language of modern progress. On a flag, school children learned that a king of iron saw a field of blood and chose compassion. The nuance flows beneath that classroom line. He chose compassion within the scaffolding of a working state, not compassion instead of a state. That is why he mattered. He mattered also because he gave historians and archaeologists a gold standard for dating. The Lumbini inscription sits at 249 bais, like a fence post. The reference to Greek kings in Rocky Dix, Tu, and Trennis pins his years within a tight bracket because Antiochos, Tu Philadelphus, and the rest of that Hellenistic bunch come with calendars we know from coins and chronicles. Those intersections let scholars date pillars and sites and stitch India's timeline with precision that earlier periods lack. When a pillar in a rice field carries his words and a village remembers a story about a just ruler, both streams meet. James Prinsap's 1837 breakthrough gave modern India back a voice that never expected to travel through centuries of silence. Even the city that anchored his empire tells the story with stubborn wood and abandoned columns. Pataliputra, according to Megasthenes, looked almost absurdly expansive behind a wooden wall. The surviving pillars at Kumrahar whisper about assembly and administration. Later excavations found the foundations of the palisade. The city did not survive in limestone pomp. It survived in ghostly alignments and stone that outlived wood. Just like the policy memos that outlived court poems, Ashoka grew the Mauryan Empire's moral muscle while keeping its administrative bones intact. He took a road system and lined it with compassion. He took a tax collector and gave him ethics homework. He took an army and told it to stand down from conquest because the cost was too high. He told neighbors in Greek and Aramaic that he wanted to send herbs, not horses. He told sects to stop dunking on each other. He told the entire empire to listen to parents, treat servants well, and release prisoners with a dignified pause. He told his own kitchen to stop cooking like a sacrifice pit. Then he told a chisel to make all of that immortal. The rise of the Mauryan Empire set that possibility in motion. Chandragupta and Bindusara built the platform: logistics, military, coinage, diplomacy, fortifications, an urban capital with a bureaucracy that clocked in and out. Ashoka took that platform and pivoted the operating system. The sound of the drum gave way, at least in rhetoric and often in policy, to the sound of Dhamma. Ancient India produced conquerors and lawmakers. It rarely produced a conqueror who recanted the taste for conquest and chose to legislate morality of everyday kindness. The epigraphic record shows such a person existed. He left that record in a way no one could ignore. The rocks still stand. The pillars still shine under dust. The lions still stare. The wheel still turns. Major Rock Edict 3 reads, still reads like a human confession bold enough to force edge its way into a timeline of empires that usually boast. It is a sometimes messy, often contradictory, deeply human story of power coming face to face with the price of itself. The Mauryan Empire rose on war elephants and grain. Ashoka's reign tried to keep those elephants fed and those granaries full, while convincing his empire to live with a kinder hand. He did not edit out pain from politics. He insisted the state could carry less of it. The archive of his conscience wears stone, not parchment. It names neighboring kings in language the Mediterranean would recognize. It assigns officials to kindness. It tells a kitchen to put down a knife. It plants a tree in the Deccan and claims the same tree for Greek lands across a mountain pass. It visits a village in the Terai and slashes its taxes because a prince had been born there centuries earlier. It lights a fire in Sri Lankan memory. It survives the knives that ended his dynasty. It outlives wood, weather, and whoever tried to knock down a pillar for building blocks. It joins the few moments in history where a ruler took peak capacity and attempted to marry it to peak conscience. Not every policy succeeded. Many got ignored. Some, like the Kalinga remorse, became exemplary precisely because they were exceptional. But the material he left matters. It anchors arguments with dates and names. It catches later romance in a factual net. It sketches governance in antiquity, not as feudal haze but as files and fieldcraft and moral memos. It shows the Mauryan Empire, rising like a monsoon river, pooling in an imperial city of towers and gates, then breaking and returning to channels, leaving silt for later ages. Those pillars, by the way, still mode switch the atmosphere when approached. The Polish hints at lost light. The lions feel heavier than they look. The inscriptions roll with authority that does not shout. They instruct with details, names of fish, lengths of reprieve, types of herbs. They build an image of an emperor who blended piety with paperwork. A modern ear hears the tone and notices the secret source. He found scale. Then he tried to find mercy within it. That is the rise and the pivot. Chandragupta makes the machine. Bindusara moves it forward. Ashoka owns it, breaks its momentum where it cuts too deep, and steers. Greek king names arrive in his prose, like footnotes affirming the date stamp. Kalinga's dead become moral teachers. Dhammama martyrs carry memos into provinces. Monoliths glow like status updates in river valleys. The empire ends with a coup, but the conscience carved in stone refuses to retire. The Ashoka chakra spins in stadiums and on letterheads. The lion roars without voice. The road trees long ago turned to ash and seed, but the idea of planting shade for travellers remains the oldest political kindness in his book. The empire rose with spears and elephants. The reign that followed tried to civilize the victory, and that story, preserved by the world's most stubborn medium, tells itself every time the sunlight etches old Brahmi letters into shadow and a traveller, 2,000 years too late, reads a king's decision to choose a different kind of power.